We all eat food, and some of us spend a lot of time thinking about food, but few of us think much about government rules that limit our access to food. That's where our next guest steps in to offer help. Donald Bryson is president and CEO of the Civitas Institute, and he recently addressed the John Locke Foundation's Shaftesbury Society on this theme: food freedom, barriers to the fork. Donald, welcome to the program.
Thanks, Mitch. It's always a pleasure to be on Carolina Journal Radio.
So when you're talking about food freedom, what are you talking about?
I'm generally talking about what are those government regulations that prevent us from having access to the food that we want to eat. I think we all probably, in America anyway, maybe not some third world countries, but in America, we have access to sustenance. But where is that sort of entrepreneurial freedom, and not to mention just culinary freedom, right, to eat the foods that we want? And what are those government barriers that prevent entrepreneurs, whether they're farmers or people maybe making cottage foods in their homes, to prevent them from getting into the marketplace? And I come at that from the standpoint that government is here to protect our rights and not necessarily to protect us, a much more libertarian point of view. And I think that in a lot of ways, government has overstepped and become more of the nanny state that we talk about an awful lot.
And this is something that should be of interest to a lot of people who are foodies and interested in more than just going to the grocery store and getting the large-scale, big producer version of your foods, but some of the things that small businesses would be creating.
Absolutely. The easiest example to talk about regarding small businesses are what are termed as cottage foods. And these are small-scale foods that people would prepare in their homes, things like cakes, pies, pickles, dried spice packets, dried soup mixes, that sort of thing. And the FDA, the Federal Food and Drug Administration, set rules or guidelines on this a long time ago, and some states have gone beyond that and set even more stringent guidelines on those, and then some states like North Carolina follow the FDA guidelines but then have a few additional labeling requirements and things like that. It makes it very difficult for people to honestly try to make a living out of their home because of all these requirements.
You mentioned some of them. Are these the types of things that few people outside of those industries really know anything about?
It is. It's a very niche thing. You're talking about, people who bake stuff in their home, for an example, and the requirements are such that if you bake a type of bread, let's say if you want a sourdough bread, and then you have to go and contact the extension department at the food science how do I say this? You have to contact the extension service at the food science department at NC State University. They will test your food so that you can get all the ingredients back for proper labeling. That's $100 per product. And if you're a small-time entrepreneur and you have 7 different types of bread, that's $700. Not to mention which you have to, if you're on municipal water, then you have to provide a copy of your bill to show that you're on municipal water. If you're on a well, then the state has to come by and test your well water. All sort of ridiculous things that prevent entrepreneurs from getting into the market. And we have to actually acknowledge $700 may not sound like a lot of money, but we also have to talk about just the chilling effect that having an inspector coming to your home has on an entrepreneur.
We're chatting with Donald Bryson. He is president and CEO of the Civitas Institute. Donald, some people will listen to what we're saying and they'll say in the back of their minds, wait a minute, but this is food. This is the type of stuff we ingest. It's important that it be healthy. It's important that it be regulated. Is it a case in which we don't need any regulations, or is it just that the regulations we have are too stringent?
I think that it's the case. In some cases, there almost has to be regulations, right? On some very perishable foods, I think it's understandable that there are some regulations, but sometimes it's a little much. And I'll give you an example that in this cottage food scenario that we're talking about, if I bake an apple pie or a cherry pie, I can absolutely sell that to any consumer at a farmer's market, out of my home, whatever. That's fine in North Carolina. But things that are a little bit more perishable, but not that much more perishable, like pumpkin pies and sweet potato pies as we get into the holiday season, I can't sell those out of my home because they're viewed as too perishable. Are we really at a point in North Carolina that sells 40% of the nation's sweet potatoes that we can't sell sweet potato pie? Like that just seems like a little bit much to me, and there's not sort of this subjective reasoning about maybe we're just pushing this a little too far.
And from that example, it sounds also as if maybe there's some selective enforcement that perhaps two types of food that are very similar. One would face no or very little restriction, while another would be restricted so much that very few people would ever want to do it.
Right. That's absolutely the case. And this is a small item, but it's one that illustrates your point exactly, which is buttercream cakes, cakes with buttercream frosting. And every legal opinion that I could find on that were basically, look, buttercream frosting is very subjective. You're going to have to contact your local health department to find out if you can sell it or not. Wait, what? This isn't uniform between Buncombe County and Wake County? I don't really understand. And, when we talk about this, when we talk about food freedom, we do polling at the Civitas Institute. And we did a poll back in October and found that, surprisingly, people are very concerned about where their food comes from. Found that 71% of likely voters in North Carolina most of the time, or at least sometimes, check where their food comes from on the labels. 86% of likely voters said that it is important to them that their food comes from farms in the United States. 71%, again, or 72%, excuse me, came back and said that it's important to them that if their food can come from North Carolina at all, that is important to them. So people actually care where their food comes from. Surprisingly, it appears that self-described conservatives care more than any other demographic. And I don't have the data points on why that is. I think we need to ask a few more questions, but that's very interesting that people actually do care where their food comes from. And so the question is, why can't we have it more local if we want it more local?
Yeah, it sounds as if people want more local food, but government rules might be blocking them from getting access to it.
That's absolutely the case, and we find that not just with these cottage foods that we're talking about. There's also the issue of raw milk that comes up. What kind of milk you want? Sometimes it's very hard for small dairy states like North Carolina for people to get access to the food they want. Honey is probably overregulated. As a product, the USDA and the Department of Agriculture here in North Carolina don't regulate honey itself, but they regulate honey bees. And so, again, another example. I like honey. I had honey on my breakfast this morning and yesterday morning. But if you we sort of have a weird sort of regulation about honeybees in North Carolina. Municipalities and counties don't regulate anyone who has fewer than 5 beehives on their property. They can regulate where they are on their property, how close they are to the road, and that sort of thing. But if you take into account that beehives only really make 20 to 60 pounds, an average beehive makes 20 to 60 pounds of honey per year, then someone who has 5 beehives is only producing probably 8 to 25 gallons of honey a year. And that's not really enough to, increase someone's livelihood very much. And that regulation is from the Honeybee Act, the Honey and Honeybee Act of 1977, has been regulated in more than 42 years. And so maybe we go back and take a look at some of these regulations, maybe at a time when we need more pollinator insects. And we have a honeybee crisis in this country, a pollinator crisis. Maybe we let entrepreneurs have more hives on their property and try to keep municipal regulators off their property.